beautiful word which stirs visions of golden fields of grain, trees ablaze with color, frost on the pumpkin, children playing in falling leaves, and the many fruits of our labors. Yes, harvest brings beautiful pictures to mind. But for 60 years in Worthington, the word harvest also meant the cold but exciting winter struggle of men and horses and machines against the frozen bosom of Lake Okabena. Ice harvesting was big business, a major crop, an important form of seasonable employment. It bought the groceries and paid the rent for many local families in winter months when farm work was at a standstill. A month or two of work on the ice field was one of the nicest Christmas presents many families could receive, and most of it happened right here at this eastern end of Lake Okabena. Little history has been written about the beginnings of the ice industry. Who started it and when are questions that even the fine historian A.P. Rose failed to mention in his History of Nobles County. However, the Nobles County Historical Society has two old photos which indicate the business existed in the 1880s and 1890s. Yellowed with age, this photo shows a large crew of men on the edge of Lake Okabena loading chunks of ice into railway cars. A notation on the front and back of the photo simply says, Ed Pennell's Ice Crew on Lake Okabena in the 80s. Another very old photo, which has been damaged by liquid on the right, shows a field of corn stubble in the foreground, a few tiny figures on the ice, and a scaffolding via which the ice chunks were loaded. This photo simply says, Packing Ice, 1890. So who was Ed Pennell? Well, according to historian Rose, Edwin C. Pennell was an early pioneer who came to Worthington in 1871. He operated a draying business until 1903, held several city offices, and was elected county auditor on the Republican ticket in 1902, an office he held for a number of years. In this book of Nobles County history, written by Al Goff in 1958, Pennell's name appears in a list of Worthington businesses of 1901 as Draying, Express, and Ice. So perhaps Ed Pennell was Worthington's original iceman, the man who started it all. Why ice harvesting developed here is a question which can be answered with no difficulty. It happened because Worthington was a natural for the natural ice industry. Railroads were here. The lake was here. With tracks skirting the edge of the ice, there was no more favorable place than Lake Okabena for loading and shipping chunks of congealed water. A system of chutes and conveyor belts was built and maintained for many years so ice could be hoisted over what is now South Shore Drive and loaded directly into railroad cars. There was a gap of about 100 feet between the lake and the tracks which had to be bridged. This system was used from the early horse and team days and on into the truck era of the 30s. In June 1911, 3 large ice houses, 80 by 30 feet each, were destroyed by a fire caused by sparks from an Omaha freight engine switching nearby. The fire threatened a bathhouse on the lake, which had become a popular spot. But the local newspaper, the Worthington Republican, said heroic work by the fire company saved that building. The ownership of the business changed many times. Charles Goosey bought the business in 1920. Harry Butcher in 1926, Alvin Graff in 1932, and Lloyd Stowe in 1943. Those owners are still remembered by a few local residents. Horse rigs like these, which were used for sawing the ice, were gradually replaced with gas motor-driven saws mounted on sleds which could be pushed by humans. And trucks, of course, began to replace horses in the 1920s, as seen in this old photo of Mr. and Mrs. Goosey and crew at the loading site. In the 1920s, about 25,000 tons of ice a year were removed from Lake Okabena. The Omaha Railway bought about 10,000 tons, and the rest was for local and area consumption. Towns as far away as Valley Springs, South Dakota, and Paulina, Iowa, depended on Worthington for their ice supply. The Worthington Creamery, which evolved eventually into Campbell Soup, was another big customer. The presence of the ice industry, in fact, was a prime reason why E.O. Olson started his creamery here. The ice business continued to grow and reached its peak in the late 1930s under the ownership of Alvin Graff. In 1937, the Worthington Globe reported that 130,000 tons of ice were cut from Lake Okabena. When the operation was going full blast, a crew of 120 men were at work. Deliveries were made area-wide by this snappy fleet of trucks, and the firm also had a car icing hoist mounted on a trunk for loading refrigerated cars. One person in Worthington who remembers the ice harvesting industry very well is this little lady I have with me. This is Margaret Graff. And her husband, Alvin, was one of the owners of the industry back when it was really going good, which was what time? When did you have that business, Mrs. Graff?
We moved here from Windham the first day of November, 1932.
Mm-hmm. And you owned the business about how many years? About 15 years?
Well, until 1943 we sold it.
Okay. Those were the years, I think, when it was really at its peak,
yes,
right?
It was. From then on, it started going backward because they were buying refrigerators.
Yes, refrigeration came along.
Yes, it did.
Sort of put the ice business out of business.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you recall? Maybe how many tons of ice were actually cut in a year out of Lake Okabena? I read someplace that it was right around 150,000, 170,000 tons a year.
It probably was because it was a lot of ice after we loaded for the railroad houses in Omaha and St. James.
Okay, were those your main customers, the railroad business?
Well, it was an extra business. You had a bid for that business to get it. The ones that would they could get by with the cheapest bid. Why they usually got it, and butchers had it. But then when we bought, well, then we got Alvin bid for it, and he got it.
Okay, so you supplied to the railroads. I suppose you supplied to the old creamery.
Yes.
And then
they came and got the ice, and they loaded their trucks and they put it in their ice house.
And then I suppose to individuals. You sold to individuals.
Well, you see, we had ice cards in town, and they'd put up their cards, and we had two trucks that were supplied the town and the business places in town.
Okay, by this time the horses were no longer a part of the scene.
Well, when we first came there, we had horses to buck the snow of the ice.
Did you really?
We did. And we had our own horses, and we bucked the snow of the ice. And then later Alvin fixed up something with electricity, you know, that he could just
scrape it off.
Yes.
A motor of some sort.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. When you say buck the snow from the ice, you mean clear the snow off?
Yeah.
That's what it was called.
We had to take the snow off before we could cut the ice.
Yeah.
Okay. And then they'd cut the ice in big blocks. And they'd cut that big block into squares. square chunks as big as they wanted them, and then a part way down, part way through. So then they'd float the squares in before they would hoist it up and take it up to the railroad cars. And then as it went up the chain, then they would split, had a spud that they just split each block apart.
That sounds like an exciting scene. Did people used to come and watch?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And we had about 100 men working we worked night and day. We had 3 shifts. So it'd be about somewhere around 30 in each shift.
It was a short season, though, I imagine. When
Yes.
was the peak of the season?
The peak of the season was right shortly after Christmas. As soon as the ice was the thickness they wanted it, that was the best ice, and they got busy right away because later and later the ice is poorer and poorer.
Okay. So the ice is cut. Then what? How was it stored, Mrs. Graf?
Well, it used to be that they stored it with sawdust. But after we got here, there was so much flax straw, and that worked just beautiful, and it was much nicer than the flax straw, or the sawdust.
Okay, you mean there was a lot of flax straw grown around here?
They'd raised a lot of flax in those years.
Okay, so that was good for the farmers then.
Yes.
You had this business going.
And it was so much easier and nicer to handle.
Yeah. Now, all of this, took place down on the corner of Lake Okabena. We call it Carly's Corner now.
Yes.
And I'm visualizing you had your house there.
Yes, it was in the end of just at the edge of the ice houses. We had come in, and the ice house was here, and our house was here, and there was a kind of a walkway. And then we go into our house, and you could go on by and to the other house.
Okay,
on the other side.
The ice houses would be the storage places.
Yes.
Yeah. Were these quite large, enormous?
Yeah, they were quite large. They were from back of our house. They were connected next to our house, and then back to almost to the barn. On the picture that you'll see.
Okay, and this is where you raised your family. You were you never could get away from the business, could you?
No. I was always there.
Always there.
And I aborted 2 men to begin with, because they'd come so early in the morning, and they'd come at probably 5 o'clock or probably sometimes before, and they'd load their ice trucks, and then about 6 o'clock or so they were ready for breakfast, and then they could go right on to get their work done.
Now, as I understand it,